Good morning and most welcome to 1356 of the series. We will continue the previous lectures with the Luxembourgian interpreter of Derrida and others, renowned author Rodolphe Gasché, and his article Ideality in Fragmentation. And we are especially looking at the author Schlegel, the German author, and the period of Romanticism, and put it into the picture together with the development in so many other areas, but in the article of Gasché specifically Immanuel Kant, the Prussian philosopher. I am at page 18, the second paragraph, last third of the page. Yet the very transcendence of the transcendental ideas or concepts of pure thought is not an obstacle to their being thought. One may well surmise that they are thinkable par excellence. But I cannot think without a category. Kant remarks in the critique of practical reason that is, I cannot think without also applying pure concepts of understanding to merely intelligible objects. To each employment of reason with respect to objects, pure concepts of the understanding categories are required. For without them, no object can be thought. However, in serving to think the intelligible and supersensible, the categories are freed of their hold in experience. is thus theoretically empty. Indeed, since sensible intuition is lacking here, no knowledge of what nonetheless is thought can be expected. Yet although the thinking of the intelligible does not a priori determine its objects, the pure use of the categories with respect to the ideas does not imply that as mere forms of thought they would be completely empty and without significance. On the contrary, in such thinking, reality is supplied to these ideas. Reality and intuitive presentation are indeed entirely different things. Reality becomes bestowed on noumena by practical reason. That is, by that kind of thinking that applies categories to them independently of the categories hold in intuitions. In practical reason, Kant writes, one is not concerned with furnishing intuitions for ideas. This is, as seen, impossible. But only with whether they do have objects or not. This reality is supplied by pure practical reason. Through practical reason, the idea acquires actuality and concreteness. This is the reason why in the realm of morality, ideas can themselves play a role that goes far beyond the one that is theirs in the realm of cognition. In the domain of practical reason, ideas have a constitutive function. Kant notes, here they become immanent and constitutive. Since they are the grounds of the possibility of realizing the necessary object of pure practical reason. For otherwise, they are transcendent and merely regulative principles of speculative reason. Which is charged with the task not of assuming a new object beyond experience, but only of approaching perfection in its employment within experience. At this point, it is necessary to recall that Kant, in the chapter on ideas in general, in the first critique, had determined the ideas as a kind of representation, indeed as its highest form. Within the genus of representation in general, the idea hovers above representation with consciousness. The latter, we are told, includes subjective perception, that is sensation, and objective perception, knowledge. Objective perception is either intuitive or conceptual. A concept, however, can be empirical or pure. A pure concept can't continuous insofar as it has its origin in the understanding alone, not in the pure image of sensibility. Sorry, I need to take a break here. So we continue, sorry for the interruption. I just read a quote from Kant. Objective perception is either intuitive or conceptual. A concept, however, can be empirical or pure. A pure concept can't continuous insofar as it has its origin in the understanding alone. Not in the pure image of sensibility, is called a notion. A concept formed from notions and transcending the possibility of experience is an idea or concept of reason. And do note here, transcending experience. It follows from this that an idea is a representation by a concept of the concepts that serve to represent representation with consciousness. Representation here translates the German Vorstellung, a term Kant uses to designate the operation by which the different faculties that constitute the mind can bring their respective objects before themselves. Yet when Kant claims that in spite of the impossibility of intuitively representing and thus knowing the ideas, they nonetheless play a decisive role in the realm of cognition. Or that in the moral realm they acquire an at least partial concretization. Broaches the question of the becoming present of the highest but intuitively unrepresentable representation that is the idea. This is the problem of presentation or Darstellung of the idea. And it is rigorously distinct from that of representation. The issue is no longer how to depict, articulate, or illustrate something already present, yet resisting adequate, discursive, or figural expression. But how something acquires presence, reality, actuality, effectiveness. first place. The question of Darstellung centers on the coming into presence or occurring of the ideas. This problem is addressed and solved in the second critique in a section entitled of the typic of pure practical judgment. To fully appraise Kant's achievement in this part, it is necessary first to indicate how the first two critiques relate to each other. In the history of philosophy, it is commonly accepted that the genesis of German idealism, that is, of post-Kantian thought, is largely the result of the primacy that practical philosophy gains over theoretical thought. From Kant's critique of practical reason, Fichte concluded that the principle of thinking, of reason itself, is moral freedom. Undoubtedly, the very notion of practical reason that Fichte invokes is already an interpretation of what Kant understood by that term. But it is also clear that the way for the ascendancy of practical reason that Fichte invokes is already an interpretation of what Kant understood by that term. And here I need to comment, it's very important to see how they, unbeknownst to each other, interpret the same thing, or rather come to the same interpretive attitude. But it is also clear that the way for the ascendancy of practical reason is prepared, if not already effectuated, in Kant's text of 1788. In the preface to the second critique, Kant notes that the demonstration that pure reason is actually practical, or what amounts to the same, that transcendental freedom is real, provides the keystone of the whole architecture of the system of pure reason, and even of speculative reason. Although the concept of freedom, that is, of the entirely self-determining causality of the thinking subject, is at best for theoretical reason, a problematic concept whose objective reality it can never hope to assure. Theoretical reason needs this concept. In its use of the concept of causality, for this freedom is required if reason is to rescue itself from the antinomy in which it is inevitably entangled when attempting to think the unconditioned in a causal series. Even though the postulation of the objective reality of those objects that had only a problematic status in theoretical reason in no way implies that any positive use could be made of those objects for theoretical purposes. This very postulation substantiates the recourse to ideas that theoretical reason has to make in order to overcome its antinomies. So you see here, my quote is, it should be contradiction-free and consistent, all of the thinking. It is very similar to the Gödelian project. End of quote. Consequently, the inquiry into how ideas are presented, into how they acquire objective reality or practical necessity, which is the touchstone on which the system rests. With it, the theoretical exigency for merely formal concepts of unity appears to have its substantive ground in the law of morality. It also follows from this that the Kantian problematic of Darstellung is an eminently practical problem. it has been observed that the section called typic parallels the section entitled The Schematism of the Pure Concepts of Understanding in the Critique of Pure Reason. It is true that both sections play a crucial role in their respective edifices. Kant himself has pointed to the analogical role that they perform. Kant's theory on schematism served as an answer to the question of how, in judgment, things as heterogeneous as an intuition and a pure concept of understanding can possibly come together. The need for a theory on typic, by contrast, arises from the difficulty of subsuming particular actions in the sensible world under the law of reason, to which, moreover, no intuition can be adequate. But apart from the fact that this impossibility of providing an adequate intuition for practical rules or concepts makes the problem faced by practical judgment more difficult than that of theoretical judgments, where the schemata allow for a mediation. of sorts between the sensible and the intelligible. There is perhaps a more decisive dissymmetry between the two theories. Undoubtedly, the question of how pure concepts of understanding, categories, can be applied to intuitions is not without relation to the question of how concepts of reason, ideas, can become the causes of moral action. Between categories and ideas, a certain kinship exists. Freed of their anchorage in experience, categories become as Kant argues in the second critique, with respect to the idea of freedom. Ideas of reason. Conversely, one ought to be able to show that when ideas become restricted so as to be able to refer to objects of sense, they have turned into categories. And yet, considering the architectonic of Kantian thinking, one wonders whether perhaps a section in the first critique on how ideas lend themselves to becoming formal concepts of theoretical reasoning and syllogistic inferring would not have represented a true symmetric counterpart to that presented in typic. I think it could be apt with a quote. I would like to compare what we just read with a little something from Shaping Science with Rhetoric, And I will ask my dear colleague Kalle to make an introduction of the author.
Hello, hello. So Lea Ceccarelli is at Department of Communication at University of Washington. The specialty is rhetoric. She's a rhetorical critic and theorist. Her research focuses on interdisciplinary and public discourse about science. She has published things about politics, like the speeches of George Bush. And she's also interested in polygamy. I think this is my own take that she's worried about the monogamy that is prevalent, and Schrödinger is a good example of, about polygamy, and this is the book Shaping Science with Rhetoric.
Thank you very much, Kalle, for that introduction of the author, Lea Ceccarelli or Lea Ceccarelli.
Yeah, this is the author, Lea Ceccarelli. Shaping Science with Rhetoric, and then she discusses 3 cases, that is Dobbs, Hansky, Schrödinger and Wilson. And your quotation is about whom?
You will see here, I have jumped to page 65, and it is the second paragraph. Despite, and just to introduce yourself, Schrödinger's book, first book of evolution, amongst other things, became a bit of an opening book, and it is in that context we now go for the quote. Despite the fact that all these scientists speak in unison about the influence of Schrödinger's book, there are a couple of scholars who have taken a more skeptical view about its effect. For example, Neville Simmons, another physicist turned biologist, who contributed to the molecular revolution in biology, rightly points out that it is virtually impossible to believe most of what one is told about things that happened 30 to 40 years ago. For him, the claim that the book was influential in the early years of molecular biology is a myth. However, he does think the book was extremely influential on scientists who entered the field after the famous Watson-Crick paper. The biochemist Seymour Cohen is also unsure about the book's immediate influence. He says that he does not remember Schrödinger's book being discussed at the summer course on phage biology, a yearly gathering that was to have a great impact on the birth of molecular biology. Francis and Crick's paper changed everything, and together with Schrödinger's book, What is Life, it became something that could not be unsaid. In the same way how Newton influenced Kant, Fichte and Schlegel, and how they mutually influenced each other. And it's especially interesting, this remark from Seymour. He's trying to, in his mind, trying to be an isolated and individual, and saying, I can tell the scope of this influence. And I think he is a bit wrong there, because the movement is beyond the books and ideas once it started. I grew up with this. For me, DNA was in my blood. The most famous philosophers today base all of their thinking on DNA. All. DNA and its specific Kantian system, to make a parallel, is what rules how we think about things as disparate as crime, the idea of criminal tendencies to be inheritable by DNA has lowered sentences in the whole Western Hemisphere. It is a big part of medicine. It's a big, big part, if not everything, of biology. And as mentioned in this case, molecular biology is a construct of Francis Crick / Schrödinger, without doubt. And even though it sounds unfamiliar, there has been at least 8 Nobel Prizes given to molecular biology. One of my favorite examples is Jacques Monod, who also became a very influential philosopher in the 60s. But I think with or without his book, this cannot be unthought, unthinked, just like the Kantian system. It rules what we talk about. The other day we were discussing morality, and inheritability was the most important aspect of that. They all agreed, we were 14 people, that psychopathy was inheritable and should be treated. So when we are in the Kantian system of DNA, it will rule everything. And whether you like it or not, you do not have a choice. It is part of both the outside and the inside. It's a Kantian system of thinking, and important to understand. When the idea of the DNA came, the Kantian, Newtonian, Schlegelian system was already in place. These things seem to be ignored, or we seem to be thinking that we can isolate ourselves from those. And that is, oddly enough, my friends, also a Newtonian Kantian concept of the atomic, of the fragment, of not being in relation to anything else. And I would say this is exactly what Seymour was expressing. Maybe a question from my dear colleague, or a comment.
Thank you so much, Hans. We could return to Schlegel. He was born in a Protestant family, but then in his youth he became an atheist. But that's an example of zeitgeist. That is, I think, the ruling term that I think people underestimate zeitgeist. Even great thinkers underestimate that we are all born in zeitgeist. We cannot escape it. So I think of Schlegel become an atheist, a pronounced atheist, so early in the beginning of the 19th century. It was almost a scandal. He must have been one of the first famous atheists, early famous atheists, so in the beginning of the 19th century. But then, so first he was born in a Protestant family, then he became of his own choice an atheist. But then, as a married man, in 1808, he became a Catholic, Roman Catholic, and that shocked his friends, all the people in the Romantic circle. And 1808, when he became a Roman Catholic, and in the same year he published an important book on the language and wisdom of India, where he argued that Sanskrit is related to Greek and Latin, and that India is the birthplace. And this was correct, roughly speaking. There are some errors in this book, but roughly speaking, we know that Sanskrit is related to Greek and Latin today. So in 1880, he came to his senses. In two respects, he became Roman Catholic, and then he published this book about the relation between Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit. And 88, I think, is fascinating to compare with Kant. Kant, what did he do in 88? He was already dead since 4 years. So lucky Kant, if we can say so. He would have, I don't know, what would he thought about Schlegel's conversion, so to say. So this was some thoughts. Okay, you can please, Hans, please continue.
I would point out two philosophers that do, but to the main thing of Heidegger is what he calls Geschichte, and it's an expansion that we are in time and space, always already there. And Wittgenstein is another one, but it is definitely rare. And usually, and I do the same thing, there's no immunity to this. You cannot go down to the vaccination store and get a shot. Usually you take out some parts of reality and, for instance, fashion, and say that's the zeitgeist, and you can look at that. And then you extrapolate that little thing to the whole and say, I know in what zeitgeist I am, or fashion. But Heidegger said, I am in this time. That is what makes my understanding possible. it is locked in a certain moment in time and space. And he was also one of the few philosophers who said, maybe in 100 years and 200 years, what I am saying now will no longer hold true, because truth is connected to where you are. What a demeanor. I will continue with the most interesting text. I recall that the problem Kant faces in Typic is that of how the supersensible idea of freedom, an idea of which no intuition is possible, and which escapes empirical experience, can nevertheless become real. That is, take on sensible existence. In Kant's own words, a practical rule of pure reason as practical concerns the existence of an object, and as practical rule of pure reason implies necessity with reference to the occurrence of an action. Hence, it is a practical law, not a natural law because of empirical determining grounds, but a law of freedom by which the will is determinable independently of everything empirical, and merely through the conception of a law in general and its form. Because of this, and since all instances of possible actions are only empirical and can belong only to experience and nature, it seems absurd to wish to find a case in the world of sense, and thus standing under the law of nature, which admits the application of a law of freedom to it. And to which we could apply the supersensuous ideal of the morally good, so that the latter could be exhibited in concreto. And yet, even the commonest mind, Kant adds, constantly applies ideas in a practical sense. Thus, the question that necessarily arises is that of the bridge between what is and what ought to be. What is sensuous and what is merely ideal. At issue is a third something that could mediate between the morally good or the law of freedom, for which, by virtue of its supersensuous nature, nothing corresponding in sensuous intuition can be found. And something concrete in the order of sense or nature. Without this third instance, practical judgments are impossible. The seemingly hopeless difficulty can, however, be overcome precisely since the subsumption under a pure practical law of an action which is possible to me in the world of sense does not concern the possibility of the action as an event of the world of sense. This possibility is a matter to be decided by the theoretical use of the reason according to the law of causality. A pure concept of the understanding for which reason has a schema in sensuous intuition. The physical causality, or the condition under which it occurs, belongs among the concepts of nature, whose schema is sketched by the transcendental imagination. In practical judgment, consequently, the question is not one of subsuming an empirical physical action motivated by the moral principle under that very law. Only theoretical judgment can deal with events of sense, such as concrete actions. And that according to the law of causality. In contrast to physical causality, which becomes established by means of concepts of nature for which imagination provides the mediating schema. Here we are concerned not with the schema of a case occurring according to the laws, but with the schema of law itself. Because the determination of the will through law alone, and without any other determining ground, connects the concept of causality to conditions altogether different from those which constitute natural connection. In other words, what is determined in the practical judgments is whether the will as will yields to the law. The the practical judgment concerns the becoming concrete of the ideal law under the form of the will. Whether such a will as which the supersensus idea of freedom takes shape truly leads to empirical physical actions according to the law, is an altogether different issue. For whose causality theoretical reason alone is responsible. Practical judgment is solely concerned with the becoming actual, concrete, real of the idea of freedom as will. This is what Kant means when he claims that in the case of the practical judgment, he is concerned with the schema of the law itself. Let us recall that schemata mediate between concepts of understanding and sense perceptions by presenting the a priori concepts, unifying function in terms of the pure force of sensibility. That is, through temporalization, which is successive presentation, and spatialization, which is simultaneous presentation. Without singularizing the concepts of understanding as images would do, the pure images of the schemata, as Kant also calls them, provide the unifying concepts with a pure sensible form. further, since the idea of causality that is not sensuously conditioned is a supersensuous concept. No intuition and hence no schema can be applied for the purpose of applying it in concreto. With the possibility of intuitive presentation being excluded, the only other possibility left is to present such an idea through understanding. That is the faculty that ordinarily provides the laws for the empirical manifold. Kant writes, "Thus the moral law has no other cognitive faculty to mediate its application to objects of nature than the understanding, not the imagination." I think this is very important too. True understanding in the sense Kantian, Newtonian, Schlegelian is not imagination. End of comment. And the understanding can supply to an idea of reason, not a schema of sensibility, but a law, also incredibly important. It's an unmovable, unchangeable law in the sense of the Newtonian eternal laws of motion. End of my comment. Hence, in contrast to what happens in theoretical judgment, where a priori intuitions of the categories permit sense data to be subsumed under intelligible rules or laws, concepts of understanding or laws. Serve in practical judgment to explain the possible application of the morally good to the will. understanding provides a law for the law, an intellectual presentation, rather than a sensuous one. Of what ought to be. Without such an intellectual presentation of the moral law, the will would not yield to the idea of freedom. Kant continues. This law required to present the moral law as one which can be exhibited in concreto in objects of the senses is a natural law. Very important, it's a natural law. Kant uses the word Naturgesetz. But this natural law can for the purpose of judgment be used only in its formal aspect. And it may therefore be called the type of the moral law. The type in contradistinction from the schema thus achieves the required presentation by which the intuitively unpresentable ideas become real. Effective and actual. By intellectually illustrating them in terms of the pure, that is, formal aspects of the natural law. The natural law is always at hand, Kant adds. In its merely formal sense of lawfulness in general, the order of nature, phenomena under law, that is, pure construct of understanding, makes it possible for ideas of reason find the hold in the will without which they would have no reality. For the type as the image of the organic nature of the senses world viewed exclusively from the lawfulness of its phenomena, freedom can become the determining ground of the will. This presentation of the ideas, commonly referred to as superfluous and void, secures their practical reality and necessity. As seen, it is not the reality of the intuitively objective, but that of the determining ground of the will. In practical reason, the transcendental ideas of the unity of the thinking subject and by extension of immortality and God acquire a practical reality in that they give the will its shape. As will, the ultimate synthetic concepts of reason, the ideas of completion, have thus taken on an objective, practical reality. This presentation of the ideas is the substantive ground on which rests the merely hypothetical use of ideas in the kingdom of cognition. I will make a summary here and have some questions.
Pause as well.
Let me give you some outline so far of the Kantian, Newtonian or Schlegelian lockdown. Kant has exactly as Newton laws, a philosopher that uses laws. The ideas are transcendental They are formless, that is, they have neither space nor time, which by default make them eternal, and also with another aspect, timeless. What do I mean by timeless? Well, they're not put in a specific position in the whole body of knowledge. That makes them lacking their roots, lacking their Geschichte, to use a Heideggerian term. So cause and effect in the whole system amounts to the same thing. It works together to produce the lockdown, and it has the factors consistent, complete. What is the guiding line for understanding? It is what Kant called non-contradiction, to make the whole area of understanding complete and non-contradictory. Thereby covering everything. And the ideas are also the same thing as perceiving, cognizing the world or the material. You can also call it the real. And in a way, interestingly enough, although the real is movable according to the laws, both in Kant and Newton, by this very position, close to the position I'm standing in now, outside the schemata, everything becomes still. I am in the position beyond. There is a beyondness in Kant. Wittgenstein would say, if they are not rooted in the specific time and space, something Wittgenstein calls use, they would be misused. What does that mean? They will not mean anything. The whole system becomes senseless just because it is a system. And this also includes the idea that Kant, and I think this is something you can go to the lecture hall and also hear. Kant is in some sense different from Newton. I would say the very idea that there is a difference between Kant, Newton or Schlegel is in itself a misconception. All of Newton is mirrored in Kant. I don't mean that he's copied it. It could have happened that he hasn't even heard about Newton. That would not matter. He is in the same Umwelt. And that is the determining. And his constant tendency, although he strengthens the transcendental is actually rather founded in experience. And what was experience at the end of 18th century? That experience was Newtonian. And not knowing that made him a copier. The truer understanding is that you are in time and space. Or maybe, if you like, Eintwurft, thrown into the world. Only in the language game can we talk and make sense, be true, be real. Kant is going in the other direction, and this is not an absolute scale. You are more to see it like Kant at this place and maybe what is being in reality with Wittgenstein here, and there are many points in between. An understanding of Kant will be an understanding of the world if we include the environment, the Umwelt. And I would say it is extraordinarily important to include ourselves in the understanding. One thing that overstruck me with Immanuel Kant is his lack of understanding of himself. It is like he's not participating in his own philosophy. He just enters into a different, otherworldly, transcendental realm that has nothing to do with Immanuel Kant. And this will make his thinking, understanding, bodiless, as Merleau-Ponty say, or I would possibly more say, not grounded in the exact place where they were made and born. And that was within Immanuel Kant. But of course, if you are in that Umwelt, going in this direction will be tempting. There will be a hand like a siren saying, "Here you find knowledge." In the singular universe, Roberto Unger took up this temptation of eternal ideas. They seem to give a very, very easy access to full understanding of everything without doing painstakingly work of being in the world. You can just, like Immanuel Kant, walk the bridges of Königsberg, access the transcendental, and thereby also know. But as I indicating here, there is a scale to it. I would suggest that going more in that direction will make bigger understanding of the Romantics what they accomplished, which is still amazing, enjoy it, and also understand it. Because the understanding of where you are makes for knowledge, whereas going into the transcendental light of too much illumination, you go into the enlightenment, and this strong sunlight light will erode all features of reality. And still it was strong enough, I think this is really clear, to transfer Sacré-Cœur in Paris to a worship hall of the light or the transcendental knowledge. They even had priests. And that was roughly the same time as Schlegel's most active period. Maybe some comments from my dear colleague here.
Yes, that's me.
Please take the microphone.
Yes.
And
yes.
do remember.
Yes. Let me draw you something. I think you will love it, I hope. So, let's begin with, I will illustrate, check the camera if it's was me.
I would recommend this pen, it's stronger.
Okay, thank you. So we have Newton up here. He died in 1727. I think it's useful to know. And Kant, he was born in 1724, so they overlapped. And he had a long life. He died in 1804. So, and I will make a caricature of Kant. I apologize to Kant, all the lovers of Kant. So we have here Kant. Can you check the camera? Is it good? You're good.
Yeah, it's very clear.
Okay. So this is Kant. And what did he do with Zeit? That is time. The German word for time, Zeit. Excuse me, Zeit. And he said it's like a Platonic idea. It's floating here somewhere. It's unchangeable, as you said, and as Rodolphe Gasché said. It doesn't move anywhere, but we saw from Liz Molin that it's a global fallacy because laws change, even human laws change. And then because when you have, like in Sweden, we have laws, it's not that laws are put first and then we have the crime. It's the laws change after the society. So we don't have the same laws today as for 100 years ago. It's the same in the nature, with the nature. Some laws adapt to nature. So they're not immutable as we saw from Liz Molin and Unger.
Roberto.
Yes, thank you. That is global fallacy to think. Okay, so that is the. Okay, so we have here a Zeit that Kant wants to think as immutable, like something Platonic. It's something that it doesn't change. It's floating up there, and he's according to Kant, he's outside of time in some way. But okay, so he forgets this. But we have, I would say, we need this. We need the zeitgeist. So he tries to, so to say, push away. It's like for him, we can use the analogy of the Tantalos stone. For him, Zeit is like the Tantalos stone that he wants to push away. He's not aware of it, I think, or he's unconsciously aware. if we can use that kind of strange phrase, unconsciously aware of it.
Yeah.
Okay. But it's still, he is inside it, unbeknownst to him. I was thinking about a book by Derrida. 1974 he published a book called Glass. In this book, Derrida actually puns on Kant's name. Kant in German means edge. And so he plays on this Kant. He wants to have these clear categories, as we saw yesterday in our lecture. He wants to put things in kind of boxes or categories, but then he forgets about these edges, that is these Kants.
Yeah.
And that's Kant's mistake. And so he thinks he lives in a kind of box, immune to everything, but he forgets about the very meaning of his name, edge. He cannot be immune to anything. So zeitgeist is important, and you cannot get rid of time how much you want. But because the very fact that money today don't want to acknowledge zeitgeist is a Newtonian trait in itself, because time is immutable to them, and that it's like a straight line, and we are somewhere outside of it, because we are outside observers. That's the point. Yes, that's the reason we don't acknowledge zeitgeist, because we think we are outside observers. We are not part of it, like in quantum physics. Thank you. Do you want to make a comment? Concluding?
Yeah, I love the Kant. Glass I haven't read. It's exactly, yes. He forgets about the edges of the borders, and we mentioned the borders in many contexts. Stephen M. Rosen, and of course this is the landscape problem of Smolin, and this is taking away the relations. Kant took the easy way, it's tempting, and of course we also have to remember in his time and age there was no choice. We have to remember it would be 100% impossible for him to think anything else. And that's another fallacy of thought, that you can think whatever you want. Let me give an example that he might have fallen off a bridge and the water would have been cold, and we have an expression in Swedish called a Leibniz knäpp, where a doctorate in Uppsala hit his head on a piece of wood and he became much more smarter and came up with new ideas. I think that happened, but you cannot go outside of this. The more he philosophized, the more he would go in that direction. And I always say, when it's a tempting thing, I don't mean he had a choice. Once entered into this path, there is no return. He was in his place in history, so he didn't have a choice that way. And this is coming from someone who don't like determinism. But sometimes your fate is sealed. I say thank you very much. Thank you, Kalle, and thank you all for listening. Have a very pleasant morning. Bye.
Thank you. 2 hours, 1 minute.